Hi boys and girls, and welcome back to another edition of Snack Time with a Dollop of Read Aloud. Okay, so in today's Read Aloud, I'm going to share with you what has to be one of my all-time favorite children's novels. And that book is Number the Stars. I've read it so many times, and every time I read it, I still get choked up at certain parts, and I still am thrown into the story and taken to another time. This book is beautiful and powerful, and I love it, and I couldn't wait to share it with you. And I hope that you enjoy it as much as I enjoy it. It is amazing. Now, it also is a Caldecott winner, or not a Caldecott, I'm sorry. It's a Newbery Award winner, which means it is excellence personified in children's literature. Yay, this is so good. It includes some of Mrs. Willis's all-time favorite things. So, you all know I love reading, but you might not have known, or you might have forgotten, that Mrs. Willis loves history. Specifically, I love the time period around World War II. I read about it. I watch as many documentaries and historical shows as I can about it, and it's just a time period that I am thoroughly enthralled by, and I can't stop learning about it. So every time I get to read this book, it takes me to another time period where my uncles and were involved in the war, and I think about their lives and what their experiences might have been. I think about my aunts and my grandparents who stayed behind and how they kind of made ends meet in Philadelphia during World War II. And then I also think about my mom and my dad who were born after the war, being part of the baby boomer generation. So there's a lot of personal connections in this book for me. And I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do with sharing it. Now, this book is published by Houghton Mifflin Publishing, and with permission granted by them, I get to share this amazing, amazing book with you. It's definitely on the level of Harry Potter, and you guys know how much Mrs. Willis loves her Harry Potter. So let's go. Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. Chapter 1. Why are you running? I'll race you to the corner, Ellen. Annemarie adjusted the thick leather pack on her back so that her school books balanced evenly. Ready? She looked at her best friend. Ellen made a face. No, she said, laughing. You know I can't beat you. My legs aren't as long. Can't we just walk like civilized people? She was a stocky 10-year-old girl, unlike lanky Annemarie. We have to practice for the athletic meet on Friday. I know I'm going to win the girls' race this week. I was second last week, but I've been practicing every day. Come on, Ellen, Annemarie pleaded, eyeing the distance to the next corner of the Copenhagen street. Please. Now, just so you know, this book takes place in Copenhagen, which is the capital of Denmark. So it's in another country. It's part of Europe. Ellen hesitated, then nodded, and shifted her own rucksack of books against her shoulders. Oh, all right. Ready, she answered. So a rucksack is kind of like an older version of a backpack. On your mark, get set, go, shouted Annemarie, and the two girls were off, racing along the residential sidewalk. Anne-Marie's silvery blonde hair flew behind her, and Ellen's dark pigtails bounced against her shoulder. Wait for me, wailed little Kirsti, left behind by the two older girls who weren't listening. Annemarie outdistanced her friend quickly, even though one of her shoes came untied as she sped along the street called Oosterbrugade, past the small shops and cafes of her neighborhood here in northeast Copenhagen. Laughing, she skirted an elderly lady in black who carried a shopping bag made of string. A young woman pushing a baby carriage moved aside to make way, and the corner was just ahead. Annemarie looked up, panting. Just as she reached the corner, her laughter stopped. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. "Halt!" the soldier ordered in a stern voice. The German word was familiar, as it was frightening. Annemarie had heard it often enough before, but it had never been directed at her until now. Behind her, Ellen also slowed and stopped. Far back, little Kirsti was plodding along, her face in a pout because the girls hadn't waited. Annemarie stared up. There were two of them. That meant 2 helmets, 2 sets of cold eyes glaring at her, and 4 tall, shiny boots planted firmly on the sidewalk, blocking their path home. And that also meant 2 rifles gripped in the hands of the soldiers. She stared at the rifles first. Then finally she looked into the face of the soldier who had ordered her to halt. "Why are you running?" the harsh voice asked. His Danish was very poor. 3 years, Annemarie thought with contempt. 3 years they had been in our country, and they still can't speak our language. "I was racing with my friends," she answered politely. "We have races at school every Friday, and I want to do well. So Her voice trailed away, her sentence unfinished. "Don't talk so much," she told herself. "Just answer them quickly and quietly." She glanced back. Ellen was motionless on the sidewalk. A few yards behind her, farther back, Kirsti was still sulking and walking slowly towards the corner. Nearby, a woman had come to the doorway of the shop and was standing quietly, watching. One of the soldiers, the taller one, moved towards her. Annemarie recognized him as the one she and Ellen often referred to as the giraffe, because of his height and his long neck that extended from his stiff collar. He and his partner were always on this corner. He prodded the corner of her backpack with the stock of his rifle. Annemarie trembled. "What is in there?" he asked loudly. From the corner of her eye, she saw the shopkeeper move quietly back into the shadows of her doorway, out of sight. "School books," Annemarie answered truthfully. "Are you a good student?" the soldier asked. He seemed to be sneering. "Yes." "What is your name?" "Annemarie Johansson." "Your friend? Is she a good student too?" He was looking beyond her at Ellen, who still hadn't moved. Annemarie looked back too, and she saw that Ellen's face, usually rosy-cheeked, was now pale, and her dark eyes were wide. She nodded at the soldier. "Better than me." "What is her name?" "Ellen." "And who is this?" he asked, looking to Annemarie's side. Kirsti had appeared there suddenly, scowling at everyone. "Oh, that's my little sister." She reached down for Kirsti's hand, but Kirsti, always stubborn, refused to give it to her and put her hands on her hips defiantly. The soldier reached down and stroked the little sister's short, tangled curls. "Stand still, Kirsti," Annemarie ordered silently, praying that somehow the obstinate, which means stubborn, 5-year-old would receive the message. But Kirsti reached up and pushed the soldier's hand away from her hair. "Don't!" she said loudly. Both the soldiers began to laugh. They spoke to each other in rapid German that Annemarie couldn't understand. She is pretty, like my own little girl, the tall one said in a more pleasant voice. Annemarie tried to smile politely. Go home, all of you. Go study your school books. And don't run. You look like hoodlums when you run. So hoodlums means kids that are probably up to no good. The two soldiers turned away, and quickly Annemarie reached down and grabbed her sister's hand before Kirsti could resist, hurrying the little girls along. She rounded the corner, and in a moment Annemarie was beside her. They walked quietly, not speaking, with Kirsti between them, towards the large apartment building that both families lived in. When they were almost home, Ellen whispered, I was so scared. Me too, Annemarie whispered back. As they turned to enter the building, both girls looked straight ahead, towards the door. They did it purposely, so that they would not catch the eyes or attention of any more soldiers. Two more stood with their guns on this corner as well. Kirsti scurried ahead of them through the door, chattering about the picture she was bringing home from kindergarten to show Mama. For Kirsti, the soldiers were simply part of the landscape, something that had always been there on every corner, as unimportant as the lampposts throughout her remembered life. Are you going to tell your mother? Annemarie asked, or Ellen asked Annemarie as they trudged together up the stairs. I'm not. My mom would be so upset. No, I won't either. Mama would probably scold me for running on the street. She said goodbye to Ellen on the second floor where Ellen lived and continued up onto the third, practicing in her mind a cheerful greeting for her mother, a smile, a description of today's spelling test in which she had done well. But she was too late. Kirsti had gotten there first. And he poked Annemarie's book bag with a gun and he grabbed my hair. Kirsti was chattering as she took off her sweater in the center of the apartment living room. But I wasn't scared. Annemarie was. And Ellen too. But not me, Mama. Mrs. Johansson quickly rose from her chair by the window where she had been sitting. Mrs. Rosen, Ellen's mother, was there too in the opposite chair. They had been having coffee together, as they did many afternoons. Of course, it wasn't really coffee, though the mother still called it that, having coffee. There had been no real coffee in Copenhagen since the beginning of the Nazi occupation, not even any real tea. The mother sipped at the hot water flavored with herbs. Annemarie, what happened? What is Kirsti talking about? She asked anxiously. Where's Ellen? Mrs. Rosen had a frightened voice, or said in a frightened voice. Ellen's in your apartment. She didn't realize you were here, Annemarie explained. Don't worry, it wasn't anything. It was the two soldiers who stand on the corner of Oosterbergade. You've seen them. You know, the tall one with the long neck, the one that looks like a silly giraffe. She told her mother and Mrs. Rosen about the incident, trying to make it sound humorous and unimportant. But their uneasy looks didn't change. I slapped his hand and shouted at him, Kirsti announced importantly. No, she didn't, Mama, Annemarie reassured her. She's exaggerating, like she always does. Mrs. Johansson moved to the window and looked down the street. The Copenhagen neighborhood was quiet. It looked the same as always, people coming and going from their shops, children at play, the soldiers on the corner. She spoke in a low voice to Ellen's mother. They must be edgy because of the latest resistance incidents. Did you read the De Frier Danske about the bombings in Hillerød and Nordborough? Although she pretended to be absorbed in unpacking her school bags, Annemarie listened, and she knew what her mother was referring to. Da Frier Danske means the Free Danes. People who live in Denmark are called Danes. Now, the Free Danes is an illegal newspaper. Peter Nielsen brought it to them occasionally. carefully folded and hidden among ordinary books and papers, and Mama always burned it after her and Papa read it. But Annemarie heard Mama and Papa talk sometimes at night about the news they received, news of sabotage against the Nazis, bombs hidden and exploded in factories that produced war materials, and industrial railroad lines damaged so that the goods couldn't be transported. And she knew what the resistance meant. Papa had explained when she overheard the word and asked about resistance fighters. The resistance fighters were Danish people. No one knew who, because it was a secret. And these secret resistance fighters were determined to bring harm to the Nazis however they could. They damaged the German trucks and cars and bombed their factories. They were very brave, and sometimes they were caught, and sometimes they were killed. I must go and speak to Ellen, Mrs. Rosen said, moving towards the door. You girls must walk a different way to school tomorrow. Promise me, Annemarie, and Ellen will promise me too. We will, Mrs. Rosen, but what does it matter? There's German soldiers on every corner. They will remember your faces, Mrs. Rosen said, turning towards the doorway and then into the hall. It is important, Annemarie, that you remain one of the crowd. Always. Be one of many. Be sure that they never have a reason to remember your face. She disappeared into the hall and closed the door behind her. He'll remember my face, Mama, Kirsti announced happily, because he said I look pretty, like his little girl. If he has such a pretty girl, why doesn't he go back to her? Like a good father, Mrs. Johansson murmured, stroking Kirsti's cheek. Why doesn't he go back to his own country? Mama, is there anything to eat? Annemarie asked, hoping to take her mother's mind away from the soldiers. Take some bread and give a piece to your sister, too. With butter? Kirsti asked hopefully. No butter. You know that, Kirsti. Kirsti sighed as Annemarie went to the bread box in the kitchen. I wish I could have a cupcake, she said. A big yellow cupcake with fluffy pink frosting. Her mother laughed. For a little girl, you have a long memory. There hasn't been any butter or sugar for cupcakes in a long time. A year, at least. When will there be cupcakes again? When the war ends, Mrs. Johansson said. She glanced through the window down the street corner where the soldiers stood, their faces impassive beneath the metal helmets. And when the soldiers leave. Now, that chapter, boys and girls, really gives you a glimpse into how life had changed for the Johansson and the Rosen families and the people of Denmark. And it wasn't much different for all of the people in Europe that were living in what we call, in parts of Europe that were controlled by Nazis. And it was a lot the same when we were talking about the Revolutionary War earlier in the year. A lot of the supplies that were considered unnecessary, like butter, sugar, coffee, those were things that were taken by the occupying forces, which were the Nazis, and those things were given to their troops. So the people living in the occupied areas of Europe were left with very little, including no extras. Now, hold on. Sorry about that. So, I really want you to think about what life might have been like for Annemarie and her family. A life without cupcakes, and a life where you really couldn't run down the street without getting scolded by soldiers. Kind of think about that and keep that thought in mind when we come back tomorrow to read our next chapter of Number the Stars. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will see you tomorrow. Miss you. Love you. Stay safe.